A white passenger spat near a black infant, but by landing, karma had caught up in a way no one expected. A white passenger spit near the black infant, thinking no one would notice. He didn't realize his arrogance would backfire instantly. By the time the plane landed, he was spitting blood, and the cabin's power dynamics had completely flipped. Subscribe if you believe arrogance collapses the instant true authority rises. Leander Cross felt the tension the moment he stepped into the cabin. Not imagined, not vague, immediate, palpable. A stillness before something sharp. His infant son, Milo, rested quietly against his chest in a carrier, his small breaths warm against Leander's shirt. The recycled air hit his face, dry and clinical, but it wasn't the oxygen that choked. It was the atmosphere. It was always the atmosphere. The unspoken glances, the instant judgments, the silent measurements taken the second a black man walked onto a plane carrying a baby alone. He didn't wait for directions. He moved with precision down the aisle, scanning the layout with practiced detachment. Seat 29C. Aisle seat. Rear third of the plane. He had chosen it for a reason, closer to the rear galley, away from the cluster of middle row disturbances. Quieter, in theory. Fewer witnesses if things went wrong. Fewer if they went right. Sliding into the seat, he adjusted Milo's blanket, smoothing the edges down with care. The boy stirred but didn't wake. Leander's fingers brushed across the top of Milo's soft cap, grounding himself in the calm before takeoff. The baby's presence was both shield and vulnerability, a weight that tethered him to patience even when pride begged to rise. Across the narrow aisle sat a man, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, a sharp jawline framed by entitlement. White, mid-40s. He had the kind of posture that claimed public space as private property. His carry-on bag sat slightly over the boundary of their shared floor space, an elbow already encroaching over the armrest without apology. Garrick Horn. The name would come later, but the type was already known. The man looked at Leander the way one might glance at a stain they didn't remember spilling. Not surprise, just annoyance that something imperfect had entered his line of vision. He didn't look at Milo, as though the child didn't count. His fingers drummed the plastic edge of his tray table. It wasn't impatience. It was provocation. Leander didn't respond. He made eye contact for half a breath, enough to signal awareness without invitation. Then he turned away and focused on buckling himself in. The cabin noise rose around them. Luggage doors slamming, overhead bins closing, the metallic slide of carts and the clipped tones of flight attendants confirming final boarding. Garrick muttered something. It was quiet, just above a whisper. Deliberate. "Hope he doesn't cry the whole flight," he said, a dry scoff curling at the edge of his voice. Leander said nothing. Not yet. His body remained still, but his awareness sharpened. The words weren't sharp enough to file a complaint, not loud enough to claim injury. But they were aimed, not dropped, meant to hit. He leaned back, eyes closed briefly as the engine hum intensified. He could still hear the faint hiss of pressurized air rushing through the vents. He'd been through this before, on subways, in lobbies, in waiting rooms. The game was always the same. You endure until endurance is mistaken for surrender. Then you act. Another mutter, this time louder. Figures. A laugh. A private joke told to no one but made for everyone to overhear. Flight attendants moved briskly down the aisle. Male crew, tall and youthful, moving with efficiency but little attention to detail. Not one looked toward their row. Not one paused long enough to notice the tension, though it pulsed in the air like a taut wire ready to snap. Leander turned slightly, unbuckling Milo's straps just long enough to shift his position, then refastened them. The movement was slow, calm, measured. Everything Leander did now had to be intentional. He would not appear frazzled. He would not give the cabin what it was waiting for. Spectacle. From the corner of his eye, he saw Garrick lean closer toward the aisle, invading space again. not enough to be accused, enough to be felt. The side of his shoe barely grazed Leander's. "You know, babies cry more at night," Garrick said, a little louder now, pitching his voice for nearby passengers. Leander's jaw tightened, but he turned toward his son, humming a soft, calming sound under his breath. Milo didn't stir. A small victory. He felt the other passengers hear it. They weren't blind. They weren't deaf. But silence had its own rules in a pressurized cabin. If no one screamed, if no one hit, if nothing spilled, it wasn't their business. Leander kept his breathing even. His left hand slid into the side pocket of the baby bag to retrieve a clean pacifier. He held it for a moment, then set it aside, a symbol of calm control, of readiness. In his mind, he ran through the sequence of events again. What Garrick had said, how loud it had been, the spacing, the exact placement of his elbow, the expressions of the other passengers who turned and then pretended to turn away. He memorized it all. The opening moves were being played, whether Garrick realized it or not. The engine pitch changed. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their cruising altitude would be reached in 20 minutes. Garrick leaned back, lips curled in a satisfied smirk. Leander adjusted Milo's blanket one more time, even though it didn't need adjusting. And the thought passed through his mind with the weight of certainty, not fear. Nothing has happened yet, but everything feels like it is about to. The longest storms often begin in quiet air. Garrick Horn thrust his elbow into the aisle just as Leander stepped past with Milo cradled carefully in his arms. The contact was small, technically ignorable, but deliberate. Leander didn't stop. He shifted slightly mid-stride, absorbing the jab with the side of his coat, and kept walking. Not a word. Not a glance. He had carried infants through worse turbulence. The moment passed, but it lingered. Leander returned to his seat, adjusting Milo's blanket with one hand while scanning the overhead panel for the seatbelt sign. Still on. Good. It meant people were watching less and moving less. He eased into his seat again, letting the baby's breathing lull back into rhythm. But across the row, Garrick was watching him. Openly now, eyes narrowed with the smug confidence of someone who had already decided who the villain was and who the audience should believe. "Typical," Garrick muttered, loud enough to carry one row in every direction. "Can't even keep a baby quiet, but expects the rest of us to just deal with it." Leander heard it. Everyone nearby heard it. No one responded. Not even the attendant who was passing by with a tray of water cups. She paused, glanced toward Garrick, then offered Leander a polite, oblivious smile, and continued. Just tension between passengers. Nothing worth noting. Leander looked down at Milo. The child stirred, lips parting slightly as he sucked the air in little half-snores, then drifted again. Leander let a slow breath pass through his nose. His hands rested, one lightly gripping the armrest, the other forming a barrier between the edge of his seat and Garrick's side. He didn't need a conflict. He needed a safe landing. "Must be nice," Garrick said again, leaning toward the aisle with exaggerated flair. "Just being able to let your kid scream while the rest of us have to pretend it's not happening. Real considerate." Still, Leander said nothing. But inside, the wires were pulling tighter. The thing about men like Garrick was that they fed on escalation. They misread composure as softness. They took dignity for docility. They performed cruelty in layers, never quite loud enough to trigger rules, but always sharp enough to bleed the unspoken boundaries. And they did it where they believed no one would intervene. Leander's calm wasn't weakness. It was containment. Another passenger, a balding man 2 rows ahead, gave a faint glance back, then lowered his head again, pretending to search his phone. Another missed moment. Another pocket of complicity. Garrick cleared his throat and started imitating the sound of a crying baby, exaggerated, nasal, cruel. "Wah," he moaned with a twisted grin. "Guess Daddy doesn't know how to parent." The sound cut across the hum of the engines. Leander finally turned, not fully, just enough that his jawline met the light. His eyes, dark and precise, locked onto Garrick's without blinking. He didn't speak. Not yet. But something shifted in that glance, something too subtle for Garrick to understand. It was not fear. It was not submission. It was a man measuring space, mentally, morally, physically, and deciding what would no longer be allowed to enter it. Garrick chuckled nervously, like someone poking a sleeping animal and not liking the way it stirred. "Relax, man. I'm just joking. You people really need to learn how to take one." Leander moved just slightly, rechecking the seatbelt sign. Still on. He adjusted his posture. One leg planted firm, shoulder angled slightly away, spine aligned. Not aggressive, just ready. Across the aisle, Garrick noticed the change but misunderstood it. "Yeah," he said again, quieter now. "That's what I thought." Leander turned back toward Milo. The baby had begun to squirm, fussing from the sound. Leander gently adjusted the blanket, rubbed his back with slow, practiced circles. The tension in his fingertips was almost imperceptible, like piano wire tuned to just before snap. Garrick grunted something under his breath, but Leander didn't bother parsing the words anymore. They weren't meant to communicate. They were meant to provoke. A few rows up, the cabin crew huddled near the service galley, unaware of the slow pressure building in the tail of the aircraft. Or maybe they were aware and simply choosing peace over discomfort. Either way, the crew's absence became part of the problem. Leander closed his eyes briefly and opened them again, scanning the exit paths, memorizing faces near him, locating a middle-aged man across the aisle who had subtly turned his phone camera toward Garrick earlier. Not recording yet, just holding it. The baby's soft cry returned for a moment, barely more than a whimper. Garrick snapped his fingers toward the aisle. "Oh, come on. Again?" He threw his head back, loud now. "Can someone deal with that already?" No one moved. No one laughed. The silence that followed was different this time. Colder, sharper. Garrick smirked again, but it was forced now, his foot tapping against the floor, waiting for a reaction that didn't come. Waiting for proof that he still controlled the moment. But Leander wasn't giving him the satisfaction. His silence was not submission. It was pressure. And pressure, misread, often becomes consequence. Up above, the fasten seatbelt sign flickered, still glowing yellow. The captain's voice came over the speaker, calm and static-laced. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're currently at cruising altitude. Please remain seated unless necessary." Leander glanced at the speaker, then at Milo. Then, just once more, at Garrick. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. He simply waited. Because some storms don't announce themselves with thunder. They arrive in silence, growing stronger beneath every breath not taken, every word not spoken, until the moment they can no longer be ignored. And when they break, no one can say they weren't warned. Some men mistake patience for permission. Garrick leaned forward and spat, a wet, deliberate arc that landed inches from the soft yellow blanket covering Milo. It didn't touch the baby. It didn't need to. The message was precise, vile, and unmistakable. For a moment, the entire cabin paused, not in sound, but in spirit. Time seemed to cinch tight around Leander Cross's chest like a noose of silence, his eyes fixed on the glob of spit glistening just below his child's face. A line had been crossed, not in volume or volume's echo, but in intent. The offense was quiet, but its violence echoed like a gunshot behind glass. Leander did not flinch. He blinked once, twice, then slowly inhaled. His body did not move with instinct. It moved with decision. His hands gently lifted Milo's blanket, tucking the edges closer without panic, as if brushing away the world's filth with precision. His spine straightened. Not out of rage, but resolution. Across the aisle, Garrick Horn smirked, the grin of a man who believed he still controlled the script. His chin jutted forward, posture relaxed, his legs stretched as though he were lounging on a throne. He chuckled, loud enough to reach the ears of surrounding passengers, but not enough to break policy. His fingers tapped the armrest rhythmically, arrogantly. Leander stood. There was no stomp, no violent flourish, just a controlled rise from his seat that made the motion more unsettling. He didn't speak right away. His eyes moved slowly, deliberately to the nearest flight attendant 2 rows ahead. The crew member was adjusting overhead bins, unaware of the moment unraveling behind him. Then came the voice. Steady, calm, precise. This man just spat near my infant son. It wasn't loud, but it cut clean through the recycled air like a bell in fog. Passengers turned. Heads rose from books, shoulders stiffened. Silence didn't follow, it sharpened. The announcement wasn't a complaint. It was a claim. It demanded to be witnessed. Garrick scoffed and leaned back theatrically. "Oh, relax. I didn't touch your kid," he muttered, loud enough for some to hear, then added under his breath, "Some people are just too sensitive." Leander turned to face him fully. He didn't repeat himself. He didn't argue. His stance was defensive, 1 foot behind the other, knees slightly bent, Milo cradled protectively behind the aisle seat's barrier. A trained calm draped over him like armor. This wasn't the first time he'd needed restraint, but it was the first time someone had come this close to testing its limits. "Don't stand over me, man," Garrick said sharply, standing in a burst, too fast, too reckless, his tray table snapping upward, water cup sloshing, the seat in front of him rocking forward from the jolt. The sudden motion startled those nearby. Someone gasped audibly. A bearded man in the row ahead looked back startled. The hum of the aircraft seemed louder now, like a current that knew what was coming. Leander didn't move backward. Instead, he shifted sideways, creating a visible shield between Garrick and Milo. His voice was lower now, spoken not to threaten, but to document. "You've escalated this," Leander said clearly, eyes unmoving. "I am not here to argue. I am protecting my son." Garrick's face darkened. The smirk cracked. "Oh, is that what this is?" he sneered, stepping forward and thrusting a shoulder as if to intimidate. But Leander's left arm lifted instinctively, not to strike, but to brace. And that's when the last thread snapped. Garrick lunged, not a wild brawl but a forward shove, arm raised, palm extended as if to grab or strike, or maybe just assert dominance in the worst possible way. Leander reacted instantly. His right foot pivoted, his left arm wrapped under Garrick's, and with one efficient motion born not from violence but from years of controlled restraint, he redirected Garrick's momentum away from the child and into the aisle wall. The sound was brief, the dull thud of weight-meeting metal. Garrick stumbled back, arms flailing to catch himself. The cabin gasped. It was not a fight. It was not rage. It was redirection, precision, and defense, witnessed now by nearly everyone in rows 11 through 15. Garrick collapsed into his seat, stunned. His breath came fast, erratic. His hand went to his mouth, where blood had begun to trickle from a split in his lip. Whether it was from the shove or his own clumsy lunge, no one could say. A boy 2 rows down pressed his face against the seat, eyes wide. The older man beside him whispered, "Stay back." Leander remained standing. He didn't advance. He didn't shout. His chest rose and fell slowly, controlling breath, forcing calm. The nearest flight attendant now stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene, eyes darting between the blood and the baby. "Are you all right?" he finally asked, but not to Garrick. Leander turned toward him only briefly. "I am. My son is too. That's all that matters." Garrick groaned. "He hit me," he began, voice trembling with a mix of anger and panic. "No," said a voice from across the aisle, a passenger with a gray hoodie and a phone now clearly recording. "We all saw what happened." The energy shifted. Garrick slumped, realizing his performance had been outpaced by reality. Leander returned to his seat with slow control, never taking his eyes off Garrick until Milo was cradled safely again in his lap, cheeks resting against his chest. Around them, no one spoke, but nothing was silent either. The air buzzed with invisible current. A boundary had been drawn, not in sound, not in debate, but in action, and no one who saw it would forget. There are moments when silence must finally speak. Garrick's body jerked back in his seat, the sudden blow disorienting him as blood began to seep from the corner of his mouth. For a moment, time didn't move. The engine's low hum became the only sound, the cabin frozen in collective shock. Leander stood firm, one foot slightly forward, hands raised and open in a gesture of complete nonviolence. The calm in his posture was unnerving. He hadn't lashed out. He had responded. The difference was clear to anyone who had been watching closely. Flight attendants rushed in seconds later, shoes thudding across the aisle carpet, but they hesitated when they saw the scene already quiet. Garrick was hunched over, coughing and stunned. His smug demeanor collapsed into disbelief. Leander didn't move. He stood as if rooted to the floor, shielding the crib behind him where Milo remained asleep. His voice came low and steady. "He spat near my child," Leander said, not to defend himself, but to document. His eyes never left the nearest flight attendant, a young man whose face was now pale with dawning realization. "He what?" the attendant asked, blinking rapidly, looking between the seated passengers for backup. Several voices rose. "I saw it. He did. That guy's been antagonizing him since takeoff. The father didn't start anything." The confirmations came from men across the aisle, some still gripping armrests, others simply nodding grimly. Garrick, his mouth red and breathing uneven, finally managed to speak. "He attacked me. He just got up and hit me." Leander didn't respond to the lie. He didn't have to. The witnesses were already dismantling Garrick's story in real time. "No," a man from 3 rows up said clearly, rising halfway. "We saw him spit. That's what set it off. The dad stood up calmly and didn't touch him until he got up first. It wasn't an attack. It was defense. Yeah, guy just snapped. Or, I don't know, maybe he didn't snap. Maybe he waited." That last part lingered. Leander didn't turn. He didn't need to. The whispers weren't threats. They were signals. People were starting to understand. The quiet man with the infant wasn't the problem. He was the line someone crossed. He glanced across the aisle. Garrick was slouched deep now, one leg twisted awkwardly, hands gripping the armrests like they were lifelines. His breathing was uneven. His confidence gone. The pilot's voice crackled overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our final descent into Marylton International. Flight crew, prepare the cabin for landing." The tone was sterile, professional, but it struck like a bell tolling for closure. Leander inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He wasn't relieved. He was focused. The landing wouldn't be the end. It would be the beginning of statements, of security reports, of rewinding events for people who weren't there. He closed his eyes briefly, feeling Milo's soft breath against his collarbone. Across the cabin, another flight attendant, a younger man with dark-framed glasses, walked up to the lead attendant and quietly whispered something. The lead's expression tensed, then nodded. Papers were shuffled. A clipboard appeared. Protocol had begun. Too late, perhaps, but it had begun. "Mr. Cross." The younger attendant approached quietly. Leander looked up. "Yes. We may need a statement from you after we land. Just standard procedure." Leander nodded. "I expected that." He appreciated the man's tone, measured, not dismissive, but there was no apology in it. Just containment. The airline wasn't here to understand. Not yet. They were here to manage. Behind them, a man from row 19 leaned forward and said to no one in particular, "I recorded part of it. If anyone needs to see what actually happened." The attendant paused. Leander's gaze flicked toward the speaker. A quiet nod of gratitude passed between them. The balance was shifting. Slowly, but visibly. As the cabin tilted slightly for approach, Garrick finally moved. Not to speak, just to pull his hoodie up and over his face, a shield of cowardice. He didn't want to be seen. Not by Leander, not by anyone. Leander looked straight ahead. He didn't need to stare the man down. His point had already been made and documented. The rumble of the landing gear vibrated through the floor. Milo stirred but didn't wake. His father held him closer, gently rocking with the rhythm of descent. Cabin lights dimmed. The city appeared below in flickers, orange grids and blinking lines. Approaching Earth after a confrontation in the sky always felt symbolic. Leander thought of that as the tires met the tarmac with a jolt. The cabin bounced, then steadied. Some passengers clapped faintly. Others remained quiet, as if unsure whether celebration was appropriate. Leander didn't move. He waited. From the intercom. "Flight attendants, cross-check and prepare for arrival." Garrick didn't look up. Leander tightened his hold on Milo, but his posture remained relaxed. Whatever was waiting outside those doors, security, questions, bias, truth, he would meet it the same way he met Garrick. Not with rage, with resolve. He saw one of the attendants jotting something on a pad. A few rows ahead, another passenger stared into his phone, perhaps reviewing footage, perhaps sending it. Every action had been recorded, not just digitally, but mentally, emotionally. There were too many witnesses this time for the truth to go quietly. The plane slowed, then turned, easing toward the gate. When it stopped, the cabin exhaled. Seatbelts clicked. People stood. But Leander remained seated, Milo in his arms, his eyes fixed on the exit but not rushing toward it. He didn't need to. The moment had already arrived. Behind him, Garrick whispered hoarsely to no one. He got lucky. His voice cracked under its own disbelief. Leander didn't answer. He didn't need to. He had already won the only fight that mattered, and it wasn't with fists. The door would open soon. And with it, something greater than air and baggage claim, the beginning of accountability. Some landings end journeys, others begin them. The moment the aircraft door clicks open, a hush rolls over the cabin, thicker than the air outside. No one speaks, no one moves. But inside, everything is about to accelerate. A uniformed officer appears in the doorway, followed by two more. Their steps are firm, rehearsed, purposeful. They've been briefed, if not in full detail, then certainly enough to recognize who they came for. Garrick Horn does not protest as much as perform, his voice rising the moment the first security officer gestures toward him. One of the attendants crouched beside Garrick, who now clutched the side of his seat, stunned that the narrative he assumed would protect him was slipping through his fingers. His arrogance drained with every word spoken around him. The mask of entitlement had cracked, and beneath it was only fear. "Sir," the lead attendant said to Leander, approaching cautiously, "I'll need to collect your statement once we stabilize the cabin. Is your child all right?" Leander nodded, voice controlled. "He hasn't woken up. He's safe." Milo lay cradled in his travel crib, wrapped in the yellow blanket that Leander had tucked in earlier. The innocence of the infant, sleeping through a moment charged with hatred and restraint, shifted something in the mood of the cabin. Tension gave way to reflection. The brutality hadn't been physical, it had been symbolic, and Leander's shield had held. The captain's voice came over the speaker. "This is your captain speaking. We've been informed of an in-flight disturbance. We're maintaining course but will be contacting ground personnel for immediate follow-up upon landing. Please remain seated for the duration of the flight." Passengers began murmuring again, but this time it wasn't gossip, it was clarity. They understood that something deeper had just happened, something about boundaries, dignity, and consequences finally arriving for someone who never expected them. One of the attendants turned to Leander again. "Sir, do you have any video footage, or would you like to request a passenger's recording?" Before Leander could answer, a male passenger nearby lifted his phone. "I recorded the last part. I didn't think I'd need to, but Something told me this would happen." Leander met his eyes and nodded once with quiet gratitude. Garrick, still recovering from the shock, now looked around and realized no one was on his side. Not one man nodded in agreement. Not one crew member looked ready to excuse him. The cabin that once felt like his theater now felt like a tribunal. Leander sat down slowly, gently picking up Milo and cradling him close. His body relaxed only slightly, his eyes still alert. He had not struck to injure, only to stop. And now his priority was different: accountability without threat, protection without escalation. As the plane continued its steady glide through the night sky, a deeper shift had already occurred, not in altitude, but in understanding. Garrick, for the first time, saw himself not as untouchable, but as recorded. Leander, calm and clear, had placed every piece of the story where it could be seen. And Milo, still sleeping, remained untouched by spit, by chaos, and by the storm that had almost broken over him. Truth travels faster when many eyes carry it. The spitting was over. The clash had passed. But the silence that followed was heavier than anything that came before. The flight was beginning its descent. Leander Cross sat still, Milo resting against his chest, tiny fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt. Across the aisle, Garrick Horn hunched in his seat, the side of his mouth visibly swollen, tinged with a red crust that caught the overhead light. He hadn't said a word in 20 minutes. Not since the confrontation. Not since the cabin saw him for who he was. No one spoke now. Not really. A few whispered, some shifted. Others stared straight ahead, pretending to read, pretending to sleep, pretending the air hadn't changed. But Leander felt it. Not just the pressure drop from the descent. Something deeper. The kind of stillness that lives between verdict and consequence. He adjusted Milo's blanket gently, his movements slow, deliberate. Every gesture was calibrated. There could be no misunderstanding now. He knew eyes were on him, some with respect, others with apprehension, maybe even fear. That's how it went. One man defends himself, and suddenly his strength becomes the threat, not the provocation. A male flight attendant passed by slowly, pausing just long enough to glance at Leander, then at Garrick, then back again. He said nothing, just moved on. Leander's mind was not on vindication, it was on aftermath. He had handled the moment, but now came the harder part. The story others would tell. The narrative would stretch, twist. The facts would bend depending on who spoke first, who filled the silence with their version. He couldn't let that happen. Not this time. Not with Milo watching, if not now, then one day, when he'd ask what happened that night in the sky. 2 rows ahead, one man leaned toward another. Their voices were low but clear enough for Leander to hear. "Did you see how close it was to the baby?" "This is insane!" Garrick barks, standing with a wince and pointing toward the back of the plane. "He attacked me. He came at me for no reason. I was just sitting down. He started it." But the blood in the corner of his mouth, the slight bruise forming near his jawline, tells a far more convincing story. The lead officer doesn't respond. He simply motions again, this time more firmly. Garrick's shoulders tense, but he relents, stepping into the aisle. His eyes dart around, searching for allies among the passengers, but finds none. Even the ones who had earlier ignored the tension now turn away or stare at their hands. Leander remains seated. He's still holding Milo, cradling the sleeping child in the crook of one arm. His other hand rests calmly on his knee, open, palms upward, a deliberate signal that he is neither combative nor hiding anything. His breathing is controlled, but every nerve in his body is alert. He's lived enough life to know that truth doesn't always walk through the right door first. It must be invited and defended. The head flight attendant, a tall man named Brent Carver, approaches from the front with a tablet in hand. His tone is clipped, professional, but lacking in warmth. "Sir," he says, avoiding Leander's eyes, "we'll need you to fill out a statement regarding the, interaction." He doesn't say assault. He doesn't say provocation. Just interaction, as though this were a scheduling mix-up over meal trays. Leander glances at the form, then back at Carver. I'll cooperate fully, but I'd also like to know who's documenting your crew's response time. Carver shifts uncomfortably, the question hitting its mark. Before the conversation can deepen, two passengers from earlier in the flight step forward, both men. One is middle-aged, with a neatly trimmed beard and glasses, holding a phone. The other is younger, tall and lean, his face pale but resolute. I saw the whole thing, the older man says. I filmed part of it too, starting just before the guy spit. You can have the footage. The younger man adds, he's lying. That other passenger, he was goading them from the start. For the first time, the balance shifts. Carver stiffens. The officers watching nearby exchange a brief look. One steps over, motioning to see the phone. The older man unlocks it and hands it over. A few taps, and the video begins to play. Leander watches as the officer's expression changes. No one speaks during the 30 seconds that follow. Milo stirs softly in his arms, but does not wake. The sound of the video is faint, just enough to hear Garrick's mocking tone, the edge in his voice, the venom in his words. Then the moment of the spit, clear and undeniable, and Leander's response, calm, controlled, commanding. When the footage ends, the officer lowers the phone, his jaw tight. Do you have a copy of this? He asks the passenger. Yes, I've uploaded it to the cloud. I can share the link right now. Please do. The recording becomes more than just evidence. It becomes protection, from misinterpretation, from false reports, from the distortion that often rewrites these moments before truth has a chance to settle. And in that moment, Leander realizes something deeper. This isn't just about the man who spit near his son. It's about how quickly stories can be flipped if no one is watching, no one is filming, no one is willing to speak up. He gives his statement slowly, deliberately. His tone never rises. He recounts everything from the start, the subtle remarks, the posturing, the intentional shoulder bumps, the escalation, and finally the spit. He never exaggerates. He doesn't need to. The facts are sharp enough. Carver listens but avoids writing his own statement. The officers take Leander's words seriously, nodding at intervals, asking for small clarifications. No one interrupts. Milo begins to stir, shifting under the cabin lights now reflecting off polished security badges. Leander soothes him gently, running a hand over his back. One of the officers, the tallest of the three, his voice surprisingly soft, crouches slightly beside him. Mr. Cross, he says, we've seen the footage. You handled this with a lot more control than most people would have. We appreciate your cooperation. Leander nods. My son doesn't need to remember chaos. That's my job. The officer straightens. Carver lingers nearby, uncomfortable, but says nothing more. Outside, the terminal buzzes quietly with muted announcements. Another plane arrives at a distant gate. The airport moves forward, business as usual. But inside this aircraft, something different lingers, not just resolution, but a quiet shift in what will no longer go unseen or unnamed. As Leander signs the final part of his statement and hands it back, he glances at Milo, who's now fast asleep again, untouched by the storm his father just weathered. Leander exhales slowly, the way someone does when they've carried not just a child, but a message, through a moment built to silence them. His objective has changed. This wasn't just about getting home anymore. It was about ensuring that what happened here would not fade, not be softened, rewritten, or buried beneath polite reports and vague headlines. It would stand, because this time, truth arrived before distortion, and it stayed. Truth isn't loud, it's consistent. By the time Leander Cross stepped off the plane, the confrontation had already begun echoing far beyond the cabin walls. The footage, grainy but clear, had been quietly uploaded by a passenger named Roran Vale, a young teacher from Carvendale who had sat 2 rows back and filmed the entire incident on instinct. The clip began just after the spit hit the floor beside Milo's blanket and captured every beat. Garrick's sneer, Leander's calm rise, the precise positioning of his body between man and child, the clash, the brief scuffle, and the stunned silence that followed. No yelling, no posturing. Just the truth, laid bare in real time. By dawn, the video had traveled faster than any press release ever could. Local news stations replayed it with concerned anchors framing the story under segments titled "In-Flight Racial Harassment" and "Father's Calm Sparks National Conversation." On social media, it was even more visceral. Hashtags like #ShieldedWithDignity and #Flying, while black surged through trending lists. Screenshots of Milo, asleep and unaware, became a symbol. His stillness amidst chaos turned into the quiet center of a growing storm. Leander hadn't seen the footage yet. He sat on the edge of a hotel bed, Milo resting against his chest, the rhythmic weight of his son's breathing grounding him. His phone buzzed again. Another alert, another message. He ignored them all until Marcus Wren, the civil rights attorney, called directly. "They've named him," Marcus said. "Garrick Horn. Background's already unraveling." Leander blinked. "What do you mean?" 3 prior complaints, 2 dismissed quietly, 1 settled. One of them involved a black teenager in a movie theater. Same pattern. Mockery, escalation, playing victim. But none of them had footage. Leander glanced at Milo, then turned his eyes to the dark TV screen across from him, seeing only the faint reflection of a father holding on. "I didn't want this to be about me," he murmured. "It isn't," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "It's about what you did in front of everyone, with your child in your arms. That kind of strength, calm, visible, undeniable, people are responding to it." That day, Leander received over 100 messages, some from people he knew, most from those he didn't. A retired bus driver wrote, "I wish I'd stood up the way you did when they questioned my grandson at the airport." A young father from Detroit sent a photo of himself with his newborn, saying, "You taught me what protection looks like." And dozens more poured in, many of them short, typed from phones with shaking hands. Thank you for staying calm when they wanted chaos. But one invitation stood out. A local community organizer, Corlan Venn, reached out from Relmore, a nearby city, inviting Leander to speak at a town hall titled "Fathers in Flight, Dignity at 30,000 Feet." It was a gathering for men who had experienced discrimination while traveling with their children, some of them quietly removed from first-class seats, others questioned about whether their child was really theirs. Corlan, a father of 4, made the request gently. "No politics," he said. "No grand speeches, just your story." Leander sat with the message for hours. He paced the room, holding Milo in one arm while his thoughts circled. He wasn't a speaker. He wasn't trained to lead movements. His objective had always been personal. Keep Milo safe, return home without damage, teach by example. Was it enough to stand up once, or did standing up mean continuing forward when the world turned to look? That night, Milo stirred in his sleep, eyes fluttering open briefly as a soft cry left his throat. Leander lifted him gently, whispered reassurances, and smoothed the blanket across his small body. As Milo's hand curled instinctively around his father's thumb, Leander stared at the tiny fingers wrapped in trust. This wasn't about speeches. It never had been. It was about the moments when a child looks at you and doesn't see fear, even when fear is justified. It was about making sure Milo, when he grew old enough to understand, would know that his father didn't just endure, he defended. Leander opened his phone and typed a response to Corlan Venn. "I'll speak. I can't promise much, but I'll tell the truth." The reply came within minutes. "That's more than enough." 2 days later, Leander stood at the back of the community center in Relmore, wearing a simple gray shirt, holding Milo close as he watched other fathers speak. Some shared quiet stories. Others let tears fall without apology. One man recounted being pulled aside at a gate because his son didn't look enough like him. Another described the silence he kept when his daughter's stroller was pushed aside for being in the way. The room wasn't angry. It was solemn, sacred, a space built on unspoken truths finally given air. When Leander took the mic, he didn't read notes. He didn't clear his throat or start with a quote. He just looked out at the faces, some tense, others waiting, and said, "I didn't think anyone would believe me. But I didn't need them to. I needed my son to see that I believed in myself, in him, and in the right to be here, undisturbed." Silence followed, not from discomfort, but from resonance. He went on, telling the story not as a battle, but as a choice to protect without rage, to confront without revenge, to endure without breaking. Outside the center, after the event ended, a teenage boy approached him. "My dad was too scared to come tonight," the boy said, "but he watched the video with me. He said you reminded him who he used to be." Leander didn't know how to respond, so he just nodded and said, "Then, maybe next time, he'll come and speak." The boy smiled. Maybe. Later that night, as Milo slept again in a quiet hotel room, Leander turned on the news. This time, he didn't mute the volume. The anchor's voice was steady. The clip continues to gain national traction, prompting calls for clear airline guidelines on in-air discrimination. But more importantly, Leander Cross's composure has sparked a growing conversation, one that's less about outrage and more about how to act with dignity when dignity is the last thing expected of you. And in that moment, Leander didn't feel like a headline or a symbol. He felt like a father who did what fathers are meant to do. Sometimes, the quietest men carry the loudest truths. The passenger smirked, confident his act would go unpunished, unaware that every movement, every witness, and every second had already been anticipated by the infant's father. If you believe cruelty under privilege always folds when strategy meets unstoppable action, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The moment the spit hit the floor near Milo's blanket, it was as if the world had shifted. But the fallout hadn't ended on that flight. By the time the wheels touched down and the statement forms were handed out with sterile efficiency, the cabin was no longer the only place holding tension. Somewhere between the runway and the terminal corridor the story escaped, and the internet, ever hungry for truth or spectacle, often both, caught wind. The airline's response came swiftly the next morning. A short, sanitized statement posted to their official channels read, "We are aware of a passenger dispute that occurred on Flight 719. The safety of all passengers is our highest priority, and we are conducting a review." No mention of names, no mention of the footage, no acknowledgement of what had transpired in row 22, of a man calmly shielding his child from open hate. But the world outside had already seen the video. A 48-second clip, uploaded by a passenger named Jordan Castle, had gone viral overnight. The frame showed Milo wrapped in a yellow blanket, asleep in his father's arms. Garrick Horn's face, red and smug, leaned forward, and the unmistakable motion of spitting followed. What followed in the clip wasn't chaos. It was restraint. The way Leander rose slowly. The way he stood between the infant and the insult. The way he didn't shout, didn't strike, but made it known, clearly, visibly, that something had crossed a line. Comment sections filled with words like dignity, fatherhood, restraint, and enough. By midday, news anchors were looping the footage. One segment paused the video right before Leander stepped into frame and added voiceover. "This is what composure looks like. This is what protection looks like. This is where silence breaks." Leander watched none of it. He was seated at his kitchen table, Milo cooing in his carrier on the floor beside him, when the call came. Marcus Wren's voice was firm, but never aggressive. "Mr. Cross, I'm a civil rights attorney. I saw the footage. I'd like to help." "I'm not looking for money," Leander replied without hesitation. "Neither am I," Marcus said. "I'm looking for change." There was a long pause. Leander leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his tired face. "Then we speak the same language." What followed moved fast. Marcus filed a formal complaint against the airline, attaching the video, a half-dozen passenger testimonies, and a clear outline of the airline's failure to respond in real time. The complaint wasn't just about Garrick. It pointed at the wider structure: the trained silence of crew members, the lack of intervention, the corporate response built on neutral words instead of honest ones. News coverage evolved from a viral clip to a systemic question: how often does this happen? And the floodgates opened. Emails poured in from travelers across the country. Stories of being asked to move without reason, of seat upgrades denied, of children mistaken for threats. Some were subtle, others not so much, but they all carried the same undercurrent silent endurance in the face of quiet bias. Marcus held a press briefing outside the Department of Aviation Oversight 3 days later. Leander stood beside him, his suit simple, his face unreadable. "We are submitting an injunction," Marcus announced, requesting the Federal Aviation Authority to immediately review its mid-flight discrimination protocols. Because this isn't about one flight, it's about every flight where silence is expected and accountability is absent. A reporter called out, "Mr. Cross, why speak out now?" Leander looked directly into the cameras, his voice low but firm. "Because one day my son will ask what happened that night, and I want the answer to be more than survival." The crowd quieted. Even the shutters of cameras paused for a beat. Inside the airline's headquarters, internal emails circulated rapidly. PR teams scrambled to manage hashtags that were no longer containable. "Protect Your Passenger" trended for 2 days. "Milo Deserved Better" didn't stop, and still the official page held the same vague message. Foreshadowing swelled like a gathering storm. Lawsuits were being discussed in hallways. Employees whispered about new training modules being drafted. A board meeting was called. But none of that changed the footage, and none of it changed what Leander had already chosen. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't outrage for its own sake. It was a decision, one made not with fists or fury, but with the unshakable conviction of a father who had finally decided that calm didn't mean powerless. The story was no longer his alone. It had become a mirror, and in it, people were finally beginning to see what had been there all along. Justice begins when silence is no longer an option. The room fell into a hush as the footage ended. Muted gasps rippled through the chamber, not loud, not theatrical, but the kind that meant no one could pretend anymore. The review board sat in a semicircle of polished wood and silent responsibility. A small placard reading "Federal Passenger Conduct Review Panel" gleamed dully under the overhead lights. No press, no cameras, just gravity and truth. Leander Cross sat still in the center seat, Milo's photo tucked into the inner flap of his wallet. He didn't speak yet. On either side of him were men who understood stakes. Marcus Wren, his civil rights attorney, leaned forward, fingers clasped tightly together, jaw still locked from tension. On Leander's other side sat Ellis Ward, one of the passengers who had testified voluntarily. Both men had watched the footage multiple times by now, but watching it in this room, where words would become policies, made it feel like a wound reopening in public. The panel chair, a tall man named Doran Vale, cleared his throat and folded his hands before him. "We've reviewed the footage in its entirety. Mr. Cross, we appreciate your cooperation. Now we'd like to understand your reasoning for not responding more aggressively when the act occurred." The room's stillness became denser. Leander didn't rush. His hands were on his knees. He inhaled through his nose, blinked slowly, and raised his gaze without flinching. Because my son was watching, he said. Just 6 words. But they moved like stone across a quiet river. Chair Vale looked up sharply. One of the panelists, a silver-haired man who had said little all session, adjusted his glasses and muttered under his breath. Even the court reporter momentarily paused before continuing her typing. This is what composure looks like. This is what protection looks like. This is where silence breaks. Leander watched none of it. He was seated at his kitchen table, Milo cooing in his carrier on the floor beside him, when the call came. Marcus Wren's voice was firm, but never aggressive. Mr. Cross, I'm a civil rights attorney. I saw the footage. I'd like to help. I'm not looking for money, Leander replied without hesitation. Neither am I, Marcus said. I'm looking for change. There was a long pause. Leander leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his tired face. Then we speak the same language. What followed moved fast. Marcus filed a formal complaint against the airline, attaching the video, a half-dozen passenger testimonies, and a clear outline of the airline's failure to respond in real time. The complaint wasn't just about Garrick. It pointed at the wider structure, the trained silence of crew members, the lack of intervention, the corporate response built on neutral words instead of honest ones. News coverage evolved from a viral clip to a systemic question. How often does this happen? And the floodgates opened. Emails poured in from travelers across the country. Stories of being asked to move without reason, of seat upgrades denied, of children mistaken for threats. Some were subtle, others not so much, but they all carried the same undercurrent silent endurance in the face of quiet bias. Marcus held a press briefing outside the Department of Aviation Oversight 3 days later. Leander stood beside him, his suit simple, his face unreadable. We are submitting an injunction, Marcus announced, requesting the Federal Aviation Authority to immediately review its mid-flight discrimination protocols. Because this isn't about one flight, it's about every flight where silence is expected and accountability is absent. A reporter called out, "Mr. Cross, why speak out now?" Leander looked directly into the cameras, his voice low but firm. Because one day my son will ask what happened that night, and I want the answer to be more than survival. The crowd quieted. Even the shutters of cameras paused for a beat. Inside the airline's headquarters, internal emails circulated rapidly. PR teams scrambled to manage hashtags that were no longer containable. Protect Your Passenger trended for 2 days. Milo Deserved Better didn't stop, and still the official page held the same vague message. Foreshadowing swelled like a gathering storm. Lawsuits were being discussed in hallways. Employees whispered about new training modules being drafted. A board meeting was called. But none of that changed the footage, and none of it changed what Leander had already chosen. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't outrage for its own sake. It was a decision, one made not with fists or fury, but with the unshakable conviction of a father who had finally decided that calm didn't mean powerless. The story was no longer his alone. It had become a mirror, and in it, people were finally beginning to see what had been there all along. Justice begins when silence is no longer an option. The room fell into a hush as the footage ended. Muted gasps rippled through the chamber, not loud, not theatrical, but the kind that meant no one could pretend anymore. The review board sat in a semicircle of polished wood and silent responsibility. A small placard reading, "Federal Passenger Conduct Review Panel," gleamed dully under the overhead lights. No press, no cameras, just gravity and truth. Leander Cross sat still in the center seat, Milo's photo tucked into the inner flap of his wallet. He didn't speak yet. On either side of him were men who understood stakes. Marcus Wren, his civil rights attorney, leaned forward, fingers clasped tightly together, jaw still locked from tension. On Leander's other side sat Ellis Ward, one of the passengers who had testified voluntarily. Both men had watched the footage multiple times by now, but watching it in this room, where words would become policies, made it feel like a wound reopening in public. The panel chair, a tall man named Doran Vale, cleared his throat and folded his hands before him. "We've reviewed the footage in its entirety. Mr. Cross, we appreciate your cooperation. Now we'd like to understand your reasoning for not responding more aggressively when the act occurred." The room's stillness became denser. Leander didn't rush. His hands were on his knees. He inhaled through his nose, blinked slowly, and raised his gaze without flinching. "Because my son was watching," he said. Just 6 words. But they moved like stone across a quiet river. Chair Vale looked up sharply. One of the panelists, a silver-haired man who had said little all session, adjusted his glasses and muttered under his breath. Even the court reporter momentarily paused before continuing her typing. Marcus nodded once, approving but calm. Leander didn't elaborate, and he didn't need to. The weight of restraint carried more than retaliation ever could. And the footage, Garrick's sneer, the deliberate spitting near the crib, the flicker of contempt followed by Leander's silent, physical stand, had already told the rest of the story. At the far end of the hearing room, a man in a gray blazer stood and straightened his tie. "If I may," he began, Garrick Horn's representative, hired from a mid-tier crisis law firm. "You may," Chair Vale replied, his tone neutral. "The footage, while impactful, may not fully reflect Mr. Horn's intent," the representative said smoothly. "There is the possibility of cultural misinterpretation, spatial misunderstanding, even—" "That was not a misunderstanding," Ellis interjected, his voice low but clear. "That was contempt." The room paused again. No one rebuked him. No one needed to. "We're not here to debate the obvious," said another panelist quietly, flipping through the transcript. "The footage, the testimonies, and Mr. Cross's consistent restraint have provided clarity." There was a beat of silence before Chair Vale spoke again. "In accordance with internal regulations, this panel formally issues a public reprimand to the airline for its failure to promptly address racial misconduct on board. Furthermore, we are recommending immediate updates to in-flight discrimination protocols across all domestic carriers, including mandatory training and a system for rapid incident documentation." Another panelist added, "As for Mr. Horn, we are placing a 1-year restriction on his eligibility to fly commercial carriers, pending further psychological and behavioral review." Leander did not shift. He did not raise an eyebrow, did not react with relief or indignation. His body remained still, spine straight, but his fingers, barely visible beneath the table, curled around the edge of his chair. When the ruling was officially read into the record, Marcus turned to him and whispered, "You did it." Leander nodded once. He didn't smile. He just thought of Milo. Milo, who had been asleep during the worst of it. Milo, who would grow up and hear one day how his father responded not with fury, but with measure. As the hearing adjourned, the quiet murmurs returned. One board member paused at the exit, turning back for a final look at Leander. He didn't say anything, just nodded with something that might have been respect. Leander stood, tucked his folder under one arm, and walked out slowly, footsteps echoing softly on the marble floor. Marcus fell into step beside him. In his arms, invisible but ever present, Milo's weight steadied his pace. Not every victory roars. Some victories rest peacefully in a child's arms. The documentary aired without fanfare, no trailers, no dramatic music, no talking heads predicting fallout. Just a still frame, a baby's blanket shifting slightly in an air vent's breeze, the soft breathing of a child asleep mid-flight, and a father's body positioned like a wall. No warning, no explosion, just a spit, a slow turn, and a boundary set. Leander Cross sat in his living room the night it premiered. Milo asleep on his chest, the lights dimmed low. The screen filled with images he hadn't seen from this angle before. Theo Marin had captured it all. The tension in Leander's jaw before he stood, the flicker of disbelief when Garrick Horn's spit landed inches from his son's headrest, the moment restraint bent, but did not break, into action. No narration guided the viewers. The footage spoke for itself. Silence was the narrator. The restraint was the plot. And dignity, unshaken, was the arc. In an early scene, Theo's voice broke the silence, not as a commentator, but as a man recounting his own humiliation. "I was removed from a flight because I looked nervous," he said in the softest tone, barely above the hum of the cabin audio. "They said I was fidgeting too much. I wasn't allowed to explain. I just kept hearing the words, safety concern. That's when I realized silence could be louder than protest." Leander remembered their first meeting. It was inside a small coffee shop near the airport. Theo had arrived without a crew, no suit, no microphone, just a satchel and a weary calm. Leander had been reluctant, not out of fear, but because he didn't want Milo to grow up under a spotlight built from fire. But Theo hadn't asked for a performance. "I don't want to tell your story," Theo had said, sitting across from him, palms open. "I want to show what happened. No edits, no extra light, just the truth as it moved." Leander had studied him for a long moment, then finally said, "Then show it walking. Don't let it march." Now, 3 months later, the footage, raw, untouched, unforgiving, had done just that. Within hours of the episode's release, the airline issued a second statement. It lacked the vague evasions of their first. This time, it acknowledged the footage. It acknowledged Garrick Horn. And, most tellingly, it acknowledged Leander Cross, by name. "We are reviewing our mid-flight discrimination protocols," the statement read. "We acknowledge the courage and restraint shown by Mr. Cross and are initiating immediate reforms based on this incident." It wasn't enough, but it was different. In a sunlit conference room weeks later, Leander sat across from 2 airline executives and 4 training consultants. They didn't come to apologize yet, but they came to ask. One consultant, an older man named Brent Hollis, slid a thin tablet across the table. On the screen, a module title in bold Navy letters, Passenger Dignity Protocol. "It's based on your footage," Brent said, not looking up at first. "We didn't just want to teach crew what to avoid. We wanted to show what restraint under pressure really looks like, what not reacting in rage can look like when protecting someone small. We'd like your consent to use excerpts." Leander paused, glancing at Milo playing with a wooden airplane in the corner of the room. "Will it be taught like survival?" he asked, "or like strength?" Brent's answer was slow, thoughtful. "Like strength. Silent strength." Leander nodded once. That was the line. The rollout was quiet but swift. Airline training programs began integrating the footage into annual certification sessions, not just for flight attendants but for ground staff, security agents, and even new captains. The clip of Leander placing himself between Garrick and Milo, no shouting, no swearing, just the unshakable barrier of fatherhood, became the centerpiece. Trainees were asked one question afterward. "What would you have done differently?" Reactions varied, but no one forgot the question. The documentary continued gaining traction. News anchors spoke of a new kind of protest. Analysts debated whether this was a turning point or a temporary wave, but the public had already answered. Viewers across the country posted clips of themselves watching the footage in silence, many with their own children beside them. Leander kept away from the noise. He wasn't interested in fame, only in impact. When Theo returned to visit him a month after the release, he found Leander in the backyard, holding Milo as the boy traced clouds with his finger. Theo raised a hand in greeting. "Did you see the new training video?" Leander gave a small smile. "I saw it." Theo hesitated, then asked, "Do you think it made a difference?" Leander glanced at Milo, then at the horizon. "I think it gave people a mirror," he said. "What they do with it, that's on them." Theo nodded, the weight of the answer sitting between them like an unspoken promise. Before he left, Theo handed him a small frame. Inside it, a still from the documentary. Not of the confrontation, not of the courtroom, but of Leander seated, eyes closed, one hand resting protectively on Milo's crib. Below it, in simple white text, "Change doesn't always march. Sometimes it walks calmly with a child in its arms." The first letter arrived, folded in thirds, without a return address. No markings except for his name, handwritten in careful, looping ink. Leander Cross. Inside, the note was brief. "I saw the footage. I've got 2 boys. I've held my tongue more times than I can count. Thank you for not letting him spit on all of us." Leander held the paper in his hands longer than he read it. He stood by the kitchen counter, Milo napping soundly in the next room, unaware of the tidal wave his father's silence had caused. Leander reread the letter, then folded it precisely as it had arrived, placing it back into the envelope like a relic. By the end of the week, 6 more letters came, from men he had never met. Some were printed emails, some scribbled in notebook paper torn from journals. One man wrote from a job site trailer in Arizona, saying he'd once been pulled aside with his newborn daughter and asked to confirm she was his. Another recalled being downgraded from first class after a gate agent assumed he couldn't afford it, despite being the lead surgeon heading to a medical conference. A third wrote only one line, "Your calm gave me back mine." Leander didn't know what to do with them. He wasn't trying to start something, but something had clearly started. The invitations followed next. Quiet at first, a community center in Baltimore, a parenting panel at a local school board meeting. Then came the formal ones, an aviation ethics symposium in Seattle, a televised discussion on travel equity, a request to appear at the very airline's internal review board, the one now rewriting its passenger conduct guidelines. The same airline that hadn't even apologized, not yet. When the call came from their corporate office, Leander sat quietly at his desk, Milo's soft gurgles in the background. "We would be honored," said the man on the phone, a regional director named Norris Hale, "if you could share your experience as part of our new inclusivity protocol training." Leander didn't answer right away. Through the window, the late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the floor. He could hear Milo gently shifting in his crib. "Let me ask you something," Leander said finally, his voice low but firm. "How many children watched their fathers get disrespected on your planes before I had to shield mine?" There was silence on the other end. Leander didn't wait for a reply. "I'll attend," he said, "but I'm not there for your optics." The panel room was bright and cold, all glass and chrome, a sleekness meant to impress. Leander wore a dark gray button-down, nothing flashy. He didn't prepare a script. When he stood, the room quieted. Executives from the airline sat in rows. Some wore discomfort like ties, stiff and choking. A few nodded as he spoke. Most simply stared. "I've read the letters," Leander began, "from fathers across the country, Black, Latino, Asian. They're not asking for luxury. They're asking not to be treated like threats for holding their own children." He paused. The silence felt heavier than turbulence. "One father told me he got pulled off a plane because his baby didn't look like him. Another got asked if he was the nanny. Another said his son still asks why the man on the plane made fun of them." Leander's gaze swept across the room. He wasn't angry, but there was no mistaking the pressure behind his calm. "I didn't raise my voice because I had a baby in my arms. But make no mistake, silence isn't surrender. It's strategy." The moderator, a quiet man named Brent Loran, cleared his throat. "Mr. Cross, if I may, what do you hope to see next?" Leander didn't hesitate. "An apology," he said. "Not for me. For every child who watched their father be disrespected and had to learn too early how silence works." He sat down. No applause followed, only a stillness that hadn't been in the room before. And as the meeting ended, and Leander lifted Milo into his arms, tiny hands grabbing at the air. Unaware of the weight he helped carry, a senior compliance officer leaned forward and whispered to a colleague, "We can't fix what we ignore." The next day, 3 more letters arrived in Leander's mailbox. Some lessons shouldn't be taught at 30,000 feet. The envelope arrived without warning. No name on the front, only an address typed in uneven font. It was postmarked from a nearby city, routed through a smaller branch office to avoid detection, or maybe just to avoid association. Leander Cross held it in one hand, Milo asleep on his chest. The baby's steady breathing was the only sound in the quiet room, save for the soft rustle of paper as Leander opened the letter. Inside, a single sheet of lined paper, handwritten in blue ink. The strokes were deliberate but tense, as if the writer had gripped the pen too tightly. "I didn't expect this to happen," it began. Leander's eyes didn't move immediately to the signature. He scanned each line slowly, the way someone reads a document looking for hidden traps. The handwriting was unmistakably masculine, aggressive, looped in strange places, sentences occasionally tilting downward as though weighed by something heavier than gravity. "I didn't think anyone would believe you," it continued. The words didn't sting. They didn't even surprise him. They simply confirmed what had been suspected all along. Garrick Horn hadn't just lashed out on that flight, he had calculated the reaction. He had counted on a stereotype, expected a performance he could weaponize. "I didn't think you'd stay calm," the letter said in an uneven scrawl. "I thought you'd react the way I could use." Leander folded the paper once, then again. Milo shifted in his arms, and for a long moment, father and son stayed like that, suspended in the silence between insult and forgiveness, between past and future. Garrick had faded from headlines quickly. After the FAA ruling and the airline's policy updates, public interest had drifted to fresher scandals. But justice didn't clock out with the media cycle. Leander had filed a civil suit with the help of Marcus Wren, but what gained unexpected traction was the parallel lawsuit from a quiet, bespectacled man seated in row 14, a man named Nolan Marin, who had filmed the entire incident without saying a word. His footage, submitted discreetly weeks later, captured every angle Garrick hadn't considered. It showed the spit, the smirk, the stumble backward after Leander's calm but firm defense. It showed passengers watching, some in horror, others frozen in their seats. But more importantly, it captured Garrick's voice, mocking, loud, shameless. When it was submitted to court, the response was swift. Garrick's employer, Eastridge Security Logistics, reviewed the case within days. An internal audit followed. His online posts were uncovered. Old forum comments, private groups, videos with dog whistles disguised as commentary. A pattern emerged, undeniable and public. He was terminated before the next pay cycle. The company's brief statement cited conduct incompatible with organizational values. Privately, their legal team admitted to Marcus Wren that keeping him employed would have made them complicit. Still, the letter came. No return address. No apology written in those exact words. Just justifications veiled as reflection. Regret blurred with self-preservation. Garrick wasn't sorry for what he'd done. He was sorry it hadn't gone his way. Leander held the folded paper for a while, weighing what to do next. He thought briefly of burning it, then of replying, just to make a point. But that's not what men like Garrick needed. They didn't need words back. They needed silence that couldn't be twisted. He slipped the paper into a folder already thick with case notes, video transcripts, and witness statements. A record of things that happened. A record that would never change, regardless of who tried to rewrite it. The civil case continued without noise, moving toward depositions and hearings. Garrick hired a lawyer who specialized in defamation defenses, an irony that Marcus quietly noted with a raised brow. But Leander didn't care about courtroom wins anymore. The moment that mattered had passed long ago, when he chose stillness over rage, clarity over chaos. Down the hallway, Milo stirred and let out a soft sigh. Leander stood up and walked to the crib, laying the boy down gently. He glanced once more at the folder before closing the drawer. The letter would stay unread again, unanswered, uncelebrated. Some letters, after all, are not written to be forgiven. They're written because fear finally caught up with arrogance. And that's when Leander understood the truth of it. Not all apologies are apologies. Some are just the last gasps of a man realizing his version of the world no longer holds. Apologies, written in survival, rarely carry truth. The plaque was already in the commissioner's hand when Leander stepped forward. He didn't expect applause, and none came. The room inside the Civil Flight Integrity Commission's private hall was quiet, the kind of quiet that honored the weight of what had occurred a year earlier. A hush of respect more than celebration. There were no flashing cameras, no PR officials herding press lines, just a small sunlit room where reform had been born, and where Leander Cross now stood, cradling his toddler son Milo in his left arm. Commissioner Darian Voss, a tall, silver-haired man with a calm, graveled voice, addressed the few attendees. "Mr. Cross," he said, pausing, his eyes scanning the modest crowd before returning to the man before him. "You did not raise your voice. You did not strike with malice. But you drew a line that changed policy, shifted perception, and reminded this industry that dignity is not a luxury, it's a standard. On behalf of the Civil Flight Integrity Commission, we present you with this recognition for upholding dignity in the face of provocation." The plaque gleamed under the soft lighting. Its wording was simple. No logos, no slogans, just truth engraved in steel. Leander took it with his free hand and gave a quiet nod, his expression unreadable but composed. Milo fidgeted in his arm, twisting toward the crowd with a drowsy blink and a thumb to his mouth. The child had no idea what the plaque meant or what it had cost. But to those watching, the board members, the policy writers, the internal affairs officers, Milo represented something more than innocence. He was the reason a man had chosen restraint over retaliation. Leander cleared his throat once, not to prepare a speech, but to speak plainly. "I don't have much to say," he began, his voice calm but full, resonant in its honesty. "A year ago, I boarded a plane with my son. I had no intention of being noticed, let alone remembered. I just wanted to get him home safe." He shifted Milo slightly, steadying the boy's weight as the toddler rested his cheek against Leander's shoulder. The room remained silent, still. Some people tried to distort what happened that night, but the truth showed up, through witnesses, through footage, through consistency. I want to thank the passengers who stepped forward, the crew who eventually reported the truth, and the systems that, though late, finally moved. He paused. The silence didn't pressure him. It respected him. "I didn't retaliate because I was scared. I didn't retaliate because my son was watching. That's it. That's the reason." A low murmur of approval flickered in the back rows, but Leander didn't let the moment become emotional. He wasn't there to perform. He was there to affirm. "Most heroes don't raise their voices," he said, lifting the plaque slightly. "They raise their children." The room stood in unison, not out of protocol, but out of recognition. Some clapped softly, others simply nodded. Commissioner Voss stepped forward and offered his hand, but Leander simply extended his elbow, still holding Milo close. They bumped arms in silent agreement. After the short ceremony, as the small group began to disperse, Leander walked slowly toward the terminal's wide corridor, his steps unhurried. Milo had dozed off on his shoulder. The overhead lights glowed warmly across the freshly polished floor. Then he saw it, the new airport banner. Clean, white lettering on navy blue stretched across the upper wall of the concourse. "Respect is not optional. Every seat, every passenger." He stopped under it, adjusting the weight of the toddler in his arms. The sky hadn't changed. The boarding processes, the gate agents, the security scanners, All still functioned under the same physical structure. But something else had shifted. Something harder to measure, but impossible to deny. And as he turned toward the exit, still holding Milo close, he read the words again, this time quietly, to himself, like a benediction. The sky didn't change, but the people in it did. By landing, the consequences hit hard. The passengers suffered immediate repercussions, the crew frozen in disbelief, and the lesson in authority made clear. If you believe real authority acts decisively, with precision and unyielding force, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, disrespect, and the consequences of arrogance. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage reflection on accountability, integrity, and standing against discrimination.